Understandest thou what thou readest in the King James Version? Here's Ruth 2:16 in the King James. And let fall also some of the handfuls of purpose for her, and leave them, that she may glean them, and rebuke her not. What's purpose? How much of it fits in a handful? Once again, I beg you on hands and knees, and also thighs and chest, like prostrate on the ground. Tell me what you think purpose means in this verse. Actually, now I'm begging you on calves and back and bum, because I've rolled over. I'm now supine, begging you. Pause the video and tell me what you think purpose means in this verse. This helps me so much. I'll tell you what I always thought, and I'll tell you why I even noticed this little phrase from the King James Version. Of course, I read it in Ruth growing up and as I got older, but I don't remember it jumping out at me. I do remember, however, running across an oldish devotional book written by a female author, I think, as I recall, with that title, Handfuls of Purpose. For some reason, that stuck with me. I've searched Google Books, and I found several books with this title, Handfuls of Purpose, at least 2 of which were written by women, so I can't remember if one of these books was the one I saw. It's funny how memory works. I just know that I remembered this phrase, handfuls of purpose. I think I sort of connected it back to the other odd King James word that I knew from Daniel, pulse. Remember how Daniel refused to eat the king's meat, which I now know back in 1611 meant the king's food, and to drink the king's drink? Instead, he asked the prince of the eunuchs to give him and his friends pulse. I was always told that that meant vegetables. So I thought maybe Boaz was leaving handfuls of vegetables or vegetable seeds or some edible plant, anyway, for Ruth to glean. And then suddenly, without warning, on a Sunday at 5:06 p.m., I got a message from a friend who watches the channel, a real reader, a graduate of my own seminary. It was about handfuls of purpose. And suddenly, without warning, I realized that here was yet another King James Version phrase that I had memorized a long time ago without understanding it, before I had the conceptual tools that I now have. For much of my life, and all of my life as an exclusive King James reader up until the age of 18, I just didn't understand language change. I got excited at this point at 5:06 p.m. I felt sure I would soon learn what handfuls of purpose meant. I like to know what the Bible means. And over and over again, even when I've read a given passage in a modern version, I found that I can't always connect my understanding of a passage or of a phrase or a word back to the King James wording. Now, in this one case, I'm going to be straightforward with you. I picked up the passage to read it, and I knew immediately from context what the phrase handfuls of purpose had to mean. Maybe you, especially if you've been watching my videos, picked it up too. That's fine. Let's go through our process anyway. First, we notice a possible false friend either through contextual conflict or through checking other translations. I suppose that I need to add a secret third means of noticing possible false friends. That would be receiving submissions from YouTube viewers. That was easy, that first step. But now we can move on to step 2. Look up the relevant Hebrew or Greek word in a responsible original language lexicon. In the Hebrew, the sentence we're looking at in Ruth 2:16 is actually surprisingly difficult. I didn't expect this, but it's something you ought to know. All the commentators, some of whom have a very fine grasp of Hebrew, are saying the same thing. The Hebrew word that the King James translators render as fall is very difficult. It usually means plunder or spoil. It occurs about 75 times in the Old Testament, and that's what it means pretty much everywhere. But it just can't mean that here in Ruth. Get spoils from the sheaves? I mean, maybe, emphasis on the maybe. So all the commentators I checked cited a 1949 article by a scholar who found a similar word in Arabic that meant pull out or draw out, like something you do with a sword, or like my knife that I was carrying, I don't know where it is now. This makes much better sense, and it yields a literal translation like the one I got from Frederick Bush's Word Biblical Commentary. I often turn to this series for their translations and their technical notes. Here's how Bush translated the sentence. In fact, be sure to pull out some stalks from the handfuls for her. The meaning of handfuls of purpose is actually in that sentence. Did you catch it? It's a bit subtle. Let's move on in the process to step 3. Third, look up the English word in a contemporary dictionary to find out what it means today. But which word do we look up? Surely we don't need to look up handfuls. Well, I did anyway. It means a quantity that fills the hand. But we knew that. Who doesn't know that? Do we look up purpose? Well, I did. But I couldn't find a sense that fits this passage in the King James. The New Oxford American Dictionary does give this sense: a person's sense of resolve or determination There was a new sense of purpose in her step as she set off. Was Boaz telling the reapers to leave handfuls of a person's sense of resolve or determination? I think not. This is meaningless, bizarre. In language, we call this an impossible collocation. You can't have handfuls of an intangible thing left for someone else. It's the word of that we're actually looking for here. I really need to do a whole video on of, but every time I consider it, I balk at the time it will take. It's so complex, so this will have to suffice for now. And I actually looked up of. The hard things I do for you guys. The entry for of in the New Oxford American Dictionary is very impressive. There are 10 senses, all with discrete definitions and helpful sample sentences. I feel certain it took a trained lexicographer quite some time to produce this definition, and that he or she built on the work of many who have gone before. It's so hard to make yourself spell out the possible meanings of a common, tiny, powerful little tool of language like of. Here was one sense, indicating an association between two entities, typically one of belonging. And here were some example sentences or phrases that the NOAD provided. The son of a friend, the coast of Italy, a photograph of the bride, with a possessive, a former colleague of John's. Is that what we have in handfuls of purpose? Do the handfuls belong to the purpose? No, clearly that's impossible. But that's what of does often mean in contemporary English, as you well know because you understood every one of those sample phrases that I read. I found the sense of that I always heard in the phrase handfuls of purpose. It's this, indicating the material or substance constituting something. The purpose was the substance that constitutes the handful. The hands were full of this thing, this plant of some kind called purpose. But that clearly ain't right. If our translation of the Hebrew was accurate, that ain't right. There's no noun in the Hebrew that's translated purpose in the King James. We need to go to the OED. That's step 4, the 20-volume OED. What did this word mean? What could it mean in 1611? And if the New Oxford entry for of is impressive, and it is, I knew that the OED entry would kill it dead because the OED lexicographers are overachievers, supreme nerds, and they have a much bigger task than the NOAD editors. The OED editors have to describe the use of throughout the entire history of English, even the uses that don't exist anymore. This is a huge task, which they have performed admirably. Have you thanked a nerd lately? Have you stopped one on the street or in your IT department, straightened their pocket protector, shaken their hand, looked in their eyes and said, "What would we do without you?" Indeed, who would bullies pick on without nerds? Who would drive back evil hordes in RPG games without nerds? Who would supply all the arcane Star Wars trivia to Wikipedia without nerds? Who would write 16 senses of and a full 60 sub-senses without nerds? Thank you, nerds. Would that someday I might be reckoned among your number. I will gladly give up my tater tots to the school bully in order to stand in solidarity with you, nerds. I can't make myself care about RPG games or Star Wars trivia, but still, I salute you, nerds. And the phrase of purpose does occur in the OED entry. But, you stupid nerds, I'm going to aim a dodgeball at your head in gym class because you didn't define of purpose. You gave me no guidance. Give me some of your tots. Forget all the nice stuff I said about you. And then, suddenly, a special nerd walks in. His name is Nathan Majewski, and he was recently knighted by King Charles as an FOTC, friend of the channel. He has helped me where the OED failed me. Oh, cursed OED, my hopes had rested in thee. I lie crushed, and somewhere in between prostrate and supine, namely on my side. But Nathan raises me up and directs my attention to Google Books, that playground of nerds. The nerds are cavorting and gesticulating wildly. They're pointing at something. Nathan leads me to the cause of their merriment. It's a book from 1629, not too long after the publication of the King James Version, written by someone named Thomas Peabody. He uses this phrase, of purpose, repeatedly, and he defines it rather neatly for us. I believe he's speaking of the institution of the Lord's Supper. And he says this, our Savior sat of purpose. Either he sat of purpose, that is voluntarily, or he sat of purpose, that is exemplarily. Aha! If that doesn't make the penny click or the idea drop, then let's try one more old quotation. This one, from what I think is a Catholic scholar critiquing the Protestants sometime in the late English Reformation. Quote, the Protestants translate the Holy Scriptures falsely of purpose in favor of their heresies. Do you get it now? Of purpose simply had to mean on purpose. The Savior sat on purpose. The Protestants translated the Bible falsely on purpose. And Boaz told his reapers to leave some grain for Ruth to glean on purpose. This just has to be what it meant, and the chickens are celebrating. What a beautiful story, and what a kind moment. Boaz, the eventual kinsman redeemer for Ruth, and the eventual forefather of King David, and then much later of Jesus himself, showed a loyal love, a chesed, a covenant love that feels miraculous. Two minor things as we wrap up. One is that my time on YouTube tells me exactly what will happen in the comments. Some people will have always understood, let fall also some of the handfuls of purpose for her, and they'll be surprised that others didn't understand, like me. Really, it's obvious from context if you're armed with even a basic feel for how English has changed since the days of the King James. I grant this. I guess I just didn't have that feel until more recent years. Some people will have always misunderstood, let fall also some of the handfuls of purpose, and they'll be frolicking joyfully with the nerds as they exult, as we exult, in our newfound understanding of a false friend. Some people will have come up with somewhat off-the-wall explanations for the meaning of this phrase, some of which I'll be able to follow, and some of which I just won't be. That happened with oppose themselves. Did you see that video? Some commenters on that video came up with ingenious interpretations that had never occurred to me for the phrase, those that oppose themselves. One who calls himself Awesome Sauce said that those who oppose themselves meant those who have self-control. Interesting. If you watch the video, you know this is wrong, but it also makes sense. Those who oppose themselves are those who oppose their flesh, he thought. I like this. It's fascinating. I think this will happen with handfuls of purpose if enough of you answered my insistent pleas to make a comment. I hope you did that. And then some people will be alerted to their error merely by my mentioning this phrase. They'll realize they have to give it another look, and they'll get it right just by checking the context. Good on them. I have no idea how many people will fit in each of these categories. I just know that using the NASB would eliminate practically all difficulty. Also, you shall purposely pull out for her some grain from the bundles and leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. Oh, last thing. I had awesome teachers in elementary school, Mrs. Page and Mrs. Schoonmaker. One of them, however, and I won't say which, always insisted that we weren't supposed to say on purpose, but instead by purpose. Teacher, he hit me by purpose. Needless to say, we never said that. I don't know where she got this. My teachers were great. They were awesome. This was the only error that they ever tried to teach me. Did anyone else ever hear this? I'm just curious. Nerds, go home.